Before we get started. Good morning, Vincent. Hello, thank you for joining. Okay, let's give it a few more minutes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the session on LLA and metrics. We're really glad to have you here. We'll just give it a few more minutes before we get started. All right. I think I'll wait until 5 minutes past the hour maybe, and then we can kick off. All right, panelists, I think we're ready. You all okay? Thumbs up if you're ready to go. Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining the session on measuring LLA and metrics. The idea of the session came about because we really want to understand the impact of the locally led adaptation principles. And one part of understanding the impact is designing metrics. And we know that metrics are quite a tricky thing to design, and not all things related to LLA can be measured by metrics. So the idea of this discussion is that we've brought together a group of panelists that have started thinking about metrics and LLA, and we want to share experiences of how they went about designing metrics. What are the trade-offs they made? What are the overall aims and objectives that they considered in designing the metrics? The format is quite simple. Am I on mute?
I can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. I'm sorry, Vincent, I think it's just you. But I'll keep going. So yes, so the format of the session is quite simple. We'll have an interactive discussion with the panelists who will first present some of the work that they've been doing around metrics and LLA. And then we'll go into a panel discussion, which will be followed by an open forum where panelists will ask each other questions and the audience can also engage in a discussion. We hope it to be an engaging and interactive session. So that's the general format. And without further ado, I can kick us off. So the first person that I'll introduce you to is Alex Tilley, who is the head of research at Publish What You Fund. And Alex, I'll share your presentation now so you can tell us about the exciting work that you're doing on metrics and LLA. So bear with me a moment as I switch slides.
Okay.
Is that okay, Alex?
Yes.
Awesome.
Great. Okay. Thank you, May. And thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to speak at the event today. I'm Alex Tilley. I'm the head of research at Publish What You Fund. We're the global campaign for aid and development finance transparency. So we advocate for greater transparency of aid and development finance. And we also carry out policy applied research using aid transparency data. So once aid organizations have made themselves more transparent and publish data about their activities, we carry out applied research using that data to show the benefits of transparency. So most recently, we've carried out a large piece of research looking at localization. So the impetus for this piece of research was some pledges that were made by USAID. So the USAID administrator, Samantha Power, made a seminal speech in November 2021, setting out her vision for USAID's direction and policy in the coming years. And this vision included two key pledges on localization. So the first pledge was that 25% of USAID's assistance will go directly to local partners by 2025. And the second pledge was that by 2030, so by the end of the decade, local communities will have a leading role in 50% of USAID's assistance. So these are significant pledges that we're talking about, significant amounts of money here that these will be applied to. In terms of the second pledge, the locally led programming pledge, the actual details of that are still being decided. So they're looking at local communities being involved in the design, implementation and evaluation of projects, but the actual definitions and terms are still being decided. But the first pledge, the 25% funding going to local partners, has been defined and decided. So we decided that we would carry out an independent piece of research to hold USAID accountable and to provide an independent check on how they're doing on that, meeting that target. So if you could skip to the next slide, please. Yes. So the way that we did this was using data that USAID publishes in the International Aid Transparency Initiative standard, so which we call the IATI standard. So the IATI standard it's an open data standard for publishing aid and development finance data and information, and it's open, publicly accessible. It's standardized across all donors and development actors, so it's using the same fields and the same standard format, and it's also machine readable, and it's published in real time. So it's published, most of the major publishers publish on a monthly basis and update their information on a monthly basis, if not a quarterly basis. And donors publish, and USAID publishes detailed information about all of its projects, all of its development projects in the IATI standard. So And that includes details about the organizations that are receiving USAID funding, so about their development partners, and about the financial transactions that are going to those partners. So for the research, we downloaded USAID's data for 10 sample countries. We looked at disbursements from 2019 to 2021. And we chose 10 sample countries. We tried to get a regional representation. So we had several from Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Central Asia, Western Hemisphere, Europe and Eurasia, and Middle East and North Africa. And we had countries from each of those. And so we looked at the financial data, we looked at the organizations that USAID was working with in these countries, and we carried out secondary research looking at characteristics of the organizations that are receiving USAID funding. And that included information about where the organizations are based, where they're headquartered. So if they're headquartered in the US or if they're headquartered in the recipient country. We also looked at staffing makeups, if organizations are staffed by local citizens or by international staff, and governing boards, and whether governing boards were made up of nationals of the recipient country or international people, and then also whether organizations were subsidiaries of international companies or international NGOs. And we carried out that research for all of the partner organizations across these 10 countries. So next slide, please. Okay. Do you want to just skip through this bit? Maybe I said, okay, yeah, great. This is the, so there were two, there were two approaches to identifying local organizations. USAID just looks at where the organization is headquartered and whereabouts it's carrying out its operations. So if it's working in Bangladesh, looking at whether if it's both headquartered in Bangladesh and carrying out its activities in Bangladesh, then it's counted as local. But we took a more nuanced approach. So we looked at where the organization was headquartered and where it was carrying out its operations, but we also excluded subsidiaries and brands of international NGOs and companies. And we also looked at the makeup of the staff and governing board, and we only included organizations that had a majority of national citizens in staff and board makeup. So if they were staffed just by international people, and if the governing boards were just international, then we wouldn't count that as local. So that we realize that there's different approaches to deciding what a local organization is, but we decided to take that approach. We have also published all of the data on a public dashboard. So if different people or organizations have a different definition of what a local organization is, then they can use our dashboard to do the same calculations that we did using their own characteristics that they identify. So what we compared, so we did the research, we compared the USAID approach with our own approach to see the difference that would make to the quantity of funding going to local organizations. And so next slide. Okay, so we have to skip through a couple of these. So if you just go, this is just the, yeah, so these are the results here. So in terms of the 10 countries that we looked at, using USAID's approach to identifying local organizations, 11.1% of their funding was going to local organizations. Using our approach, 5.7% of funding was going to local organizations. So in order to reach the 25% target that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, using USAID's approach, they would need to increase that by another 14%. Using our approach, we'd be looking at almost 20% more of USAID's funding going to those organizations. And in terms of actual funding dollar amounts, this was around $250 The difference between the two amounts that would need to be additionally given additionally. Using our approach, an additional $244 million per year would need to go to local organizations to meet the 25% target. And so that was for our 10 sample countries. We then extrapolated and scaled that up to all of USAID. USAID operates in around 100 countries around the world. And extrapolating up that difference, the measurement difference would be about $1.43 billion per year additional that would need to go to local organizations using our approach. So we feel that it's important that the localization target that USAID has set really channels funds to local organizations that have these local characteristics, and that they should use an approach that accounts for those different local characteristics, and that meeting that 25% target should be done in the best possible way that meets the needs of local organizations. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. I think given that this is quite a small group, we can take a couple of clarifications if you don't mind.
Sure.
We have a comment from Vincent, if you can see in the chat. How does the USAID 25% commitment relate to the US State Department commitment under the Life AR Partnership Compact signed at COP26 that at least 70% of climate finance will support locally led adaptation actions by 2030? How will they reconcile these separate US government targets? Will they use same or different metrics? And then afterwards, we'll come to you, Celine.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so at least 70% of climate finance will support local, but that's US State Department. Okay, so that may be within the targets that were set. So the targets that were set out by Samantha Power were for all of USAID's aid and development finance. So going from USAID, it wasn't climate specific. So it looks like they actually have a target for the climate finance itself that's higher. So so it looks like if that's the target for climate finance, it looks like a lot of that 25% commitment will be USAID's climate finance. I know that the US gives a lot of its climate finance through multinational institutions, so it gives a lot to it gives through multilateral development banks like the World Bank and regional development banks, and also the Green Climate Fund it gives a large contribution to. So I'm not sure how it will relate to those, but certainly it seems like the target for climate finance is even higher than the target for their general development.
Shall we take a question from you, Salim? Did Salim have his hand raised? Okay, we can come back to you, Salim. Thanks a lot, Alex. I think that's the really interesting statistics, and we can go into that in a later part of the discussion as well. So thanks so much. Florence, are you ready? I'll come over to you. Switch my slides.
Hi, I'm Florence. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Okay, so this will have a bit more brevity than Alex's presentation, which was really interesting and quite damning, I think, to apply a slightly different metric to how USAID defines locally led adaptation. So this is something that I worked on as a researcher at ODI We were tasked with knowledge management of the BRACED program during its inception phase. So this was something that we worked on around 2015 when resilience was sort of a really big concept that was blowing up in the locally led adaptation community. BRACED is a really complex program. It entailed 15 projects in 13 different countries on different continents, of course, and all undertaking different kinds of locally led adaptation investments and activities. So trying to make sense of that and aggregate what we could learn from it was a challenge. All of these programs had their own traditional M&E systems for tracking progress against their activities and outputs. They all had a theory of change. But what we really wanted to try to understand and pull together was whether they would be successful in not just enhancing mobility for pastoralists in the Sahel or diversifying output for farmers in Nepal, but are they actually making people more resilient to climate change? And how can we try to understand that? So in effect, we're creating another layer of measurement on top of what was already occurring through the traditional M&E systems. But we were trying to use the M&E, the data that they were already collecting to do that. So we weren't sort of adding to the measurement burden that I think everyone in this group will know all too well. So as a think tank, of course, the starting point for this was going to the conceptual literature on resilience, which, you know, we've all asked ourselves, what is resilience? How do you know if a person, a household, a community, a country is more resilient because of an intervention? It's been said before, there's a lot of papers in ODI, ink has been spilled on the various definitions of resilience, a lot of diverse perspectives, but we could see quite a lot of it coalescing around resilience capacities. It's almost like Amartya Sen's capabilities, right? It's about the ability to do something. It's not just a kind of static thing. So and by looking at capacities, we're effectively saying, you know, in one community, you might make an investment in water infrastructure. But when there's a drought in that community, we still know that 2 different households are going to experience that differently. So those households have different capacities. And what are the different factors that contribute to that, to them being more resilient, more vulnerable, et cetera? So anticipatory capacity was effectively the capacity to anticipate some kind of disaster or climate extreme, prepare for it. Absorptive capacity is the ability to cope with climate extremes, and adaptive capacity is the ability to make longer-term changes and adaptations. So different project indicators were pegged against these different capacities, and then we were looking across projects to try to get a longer view of how these projects were attempting to make people more resilient to climate change. I can go into more detail when we go into questions about how it worked in practice, the things that were good and bad about it. But one thing that I will say is that the approach really enabled us to aggregate across projects. We had really consistent reporting and we could compare between projects, which is something that was really challenging when we're talking about projects working on different topics in different parts of the world. So that's the introduction to BRACED. I'm happy to answer more questions about it as we go on.
That's great. Any clarification questions for Florence? Otherwise, we can move on. And definitely, I think there's a lot more to unpack about what you mentioned already. Okay, we'll come back to you, Florence. Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Mercy, who is a conservation researcher who was doing some work at Flora and Fauna International on measuring how locally aligned projects were to the LLA principles. Okay, Mercy, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Let me get your slide up.
Okay.
Oops. Go ahead, Mercy.
Okay. So I worked on this last year. It was part of my placement project in Cambridge. And the interest for FFI, who already works with grassroots communities, was to assess, after they endorsed the LLAs in 2021, they wanted to understand how that translates into their work and basically how it can be integrated in their conservation projects But since most of the projects had already started, and one of them was actually about 10 years in practice, they wanted to find out how LLEs are practiced because they're not necessarily new concepts for them. And also how to assess their successes, their failures and opportunities and areas where they could improve. But most importantly, we also wanted to have a sort of framework on having a standard practice on how they assess from the HQ to all the different projects in the different continents where they work in. And also to identify best practices and see if they can formulate recommendations for the people who wanted to adopt them further, and to also how they can be integrated as standard practice, as I said earlier, and also to identify opportunities and barriers in financing the nature-based solutions work. So how I went about it is I took 3 projects, 3 case studies in 3 different geographical regions. One project was in Nicaragua, which was the longest running project. And the other one was in Uganda, and the other one was in Myanmar. So ideally, they wanted to check whether all these projects had elements of LLAs in them. So the first thing I did was to develop indicators for all 8 principles. And also then after that, developed a traffic light model to assess each of those indicators against the criteria that we developed. So ideally, it was a lot easier because FFI already works with grassroots communities. So all the projects were actually in local communities, and all of them had an element of an endangered species and a livelihood project in it, or element in the project. And all of them were funded by FFI. So ideally, it was a lot easier to work with. And we can get into details, and I'm happy to share the metrics and how we went about it, but I'm sure that will come into discussion. So generally, that's a general overview of how we went about it.
All right, that was a whirlwind tour of what you did. I'm sure there's a lot more to say about it. We'll come back to you, and thank you so much.
All right.
All right, last but not least, I'll ask Bertha to present. Bertha is a senior policy advisor at German Watch. Bertha, are you there?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. Okay, I'll bring up your
Great.
presentation.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Bertha.
Thanks. Yeah. So just to introduce a little bit, I mean, my presentation is based on a publication we published last year on locally led adaptation in the Green Climate Fund, which was assessing the performance of the fund across its entire portfolio, specifically for Africa. And just quickly to give you the context of why this paper came out, it was basically in the context of a project that was set to capitalize and enhance the engagement of civil society organizations in Africa to engage with the Green Climate Fund at different levels. So this paper was actually, this brief, how we call it, was actually developing in collaboration with the partners of this project, which are all African civil society organizations. So basically the idea, because obviously the focus of the project and therefore the brief is to look at the performance of the Green Climate Fund. The paper examined the extent to which the current, or at least up until last year, the GCF funded projects and programs support adaptation at the subnational or local level in African states. So what we did was to review the entire portfolio of projects approved for African states up until October last year, September maybe, to assess these projects against the principles for locally led adaptation. Of course, it's important to note that this is not an assessment of the implementation of these projects, because that would require actually looking at, like the results of the monitoring and evaluation, which it's not easy to access in the GCF, and it's also not necessarily always available because some of these projects are not yet under implementation. It was more of a look at the design of the project. So we don't actually fully know what the implementation of these projects is or will look like on the ground, but it was more to see how the GCF plans, or like more the accredited entities of the GCF, for those that know how the GCF works. It doesn't implement projects directly, but through partnership with other organizations. So how these organizations planned to include locally led adaptation principles in their proposals. From that, of course, we try also to draw broader lessons about the GCF policies, because even though they are not the ones planning or implementing the projects themselves, they do establish the policies that like kind of are used to design these projects, and so some lessons can be drawn from this particular review of the funding proposals or the project planning documents on what the GCF is doing and is not doing to really let's say mainstream locally led adaptation in their policies and their funded activities. So for this analysis, we decided that the local level would refer to subnational actors, whether they were public or private, civil society or community organizations. So anything that was working at the subnational level. And basically what we did was something very similar to the previous presenter, which is basically take the principles, because they're just principles, and try to develop indicators to measure these principles. And from those indicators, develop questions that we would ask every time we reviewed a funding proposal to assess whether, I don't want to say they were complying, because there's no obligation to actually integrate locally led adaptation in the GCF, but whether they were taking into consideration these principles or not. And just quickly, the first thing is that we did try to assess also whether this is more qualitative, of course, but we did try to also assess the amount of funding that were actually reaching the local level under that definition, but we couldn't, because the transparency of exactly where the money goes to the level of detail that we would need to know whether it's reaching local organizations or subnational governments or the local private sector is not available, or at least not publicly available. So we didn't have that quantitative part of the analysis. So we focus more on the qualitative analysis of whether the funding proposals are considering locally led adaptation principles. The results showed more or less mostly limited consideration of local needs and priorities in adaptation planning and programming, especially from international entities. And again, this is in the context of the GCF, the implementing entities can be international, which is the traditional, like UN agencies, multilateral development banks, and private sector international organizations. So usually you would see less of these consideration of local needs and priorities when the entity that was planning and implementing the project was an international one, and a bit more of a consideration when the planning and implementing entity was a national one. And it also confirmed, a result of also confirmed something we already kind of felt was the case, which is a misalignment between the scale of projects, the impact, and the implementation speed, with sometimes the most impactful projects being relatively small and closer to the ground. And this is important, not because this is not often, said, but because if you are aware of the conversations within the GCF, sometimes the discourse in the GCF is the opposite, that that the bigger the scale, that the faster the disbursement, that means more impact. And finally, some of the other there were many findings, so I'm just trying to summarize real quickly here. It also showed that grant funding remains and will remain a vital instrument for supporting adaptation action, especially at the subnational level. And this is also important in the context of the fund, because the general discourse is also that because of the need for scale, we need to be moving away from only grant funding for adaptation to other instruments like equity investments and, mostly equity investments really, but also loans, if we want to achieve impact on adaptation. So I'll stop here because I know we'll have some more time to have a conversation, but thank you.
Thanks, Bertha. There is a follow-up question for you from Vincent in the chat. Is the GCF more recent adoption of the EDA approaches improving their consideration of local needs? I guess that's a big question, but I wonder if there's a quick way to answer that.
There is, I think, a quick way to answer that. And the answer is yes. So we did analyze one of the first EDAs that the GCF had was in Namibia, which is, it's a very close partner of the project. And well, we also analyzed it because obviously we did analyze the entire portfolio. And that's actually our star case. We did have like at the end of the brief, we chose a few cases that we found that were like good practices in terms of integrating the local adaptation principles, and the EDA of Namibia was the one that like more closely aligned with these principles. Now, that doesn't mean the GCF adoption of the approach is necessarily improving, I would say, at a more portfolio level, because since the GCF approved it or opened this window of enhanced direct access, there's only been 3 or 4 funding proposals, I can't remember, but I think 3 funding proposals that have fallen into enhanced direct access. They have found it very hard to fund direct access. So the pilot exists. In theory, that window exists. In practice, most of the funding proposals don't go through that window. There's many explanations for why that is the case. I guess it depends who you ask. But our contention in here is that as long as, and this is actually interestingly something that's coming up now, because again, for those aware of the GCF, they're coming into a second replenishment period, and there's a lot of discussion about the vision and the future of the fund. And integration of enhanced direct access is part of that discussion, but it is still relegated to a pilot. It's still relegated to, let's say, a very small part of the overall funding of the GCF. And not really, the conversation in general is not being integrated across the entire fund, but it's just being like relegated to a little part of it. So I would say the GCF has, through its work, kind of demonstrated that this can work, because we have seen the EDA in Namibia, but it still doesn't move a step further and try to actually integrate these more into the entire portfolio. It just relegates it to a small pilot thing. And so I think that's kind of, maybe it wasn't that short as I thought it was going to be, but as short as I could make it. I hope that answers the question.
Great. I think it's also a great segue into the next question, or the first question that I'll ask all the panelists. What is the point of metrics? It seems like all of you are looking at metrics because USAID asked for it, because you wanted to look at how GCF was performing. Fora and Fora International, who have endorsed the principles of LLA, and Florence Brace, you were trying, I assume it was a donor-led process. So what is the point of doing these metrics, just taking a step back, and who are we doing them for? Would anyone like to take a stab at this question? Go ahead, Florence.
So I'll start on this, and this also touches on Vincent's question about why we would compare across projects. So I was saying that Braced helped us with aggregation of sort of the outcomes across projects, having consistency of reporting, and comparing between them. So if you want to aggregate the outcomes, that's for the donor, really. Why would you do that? It really is for the donor. To have consistent reporting, that's also for the donor, because it doesn't really make a difference to an implementer if the reporting is consistent between different partners. And to compare between projects is something a little different, because there's some learning that could potentially happen if there's like-minded organizations that are able to sort of work together. Some of the things that are done in a lot of these different kinds of adaptation, locally led adaptation consortiums, like what the ARA is trying to do by building a community of practice. So if we're thinking about the aggregation of outcomes, that's really for a donor who's reporting against a KPI, which was definitely the case in Braced. The finance came from the International Climate Fund. They had a key performance indicator about the number of people whose resilience would be enhanced through the support that they provided. So it did achieve accountability, but of course, it's still that upward accountability to the donor. And it's really obvious that we can lose a lot of learning by reducing the achievement of all these different projects to a single number of, however many thousands or millions of people were reached. So for that kind of M&E, implementers aren't really learning what's worked, and it doesn't really tell us about anything between contexts. So the advantage with Braced is that we were able to do a lot of different qualitative research alongside the M&E. So we had more focused qualitative studies, those kinds of evaluative learning processes, but that is really resource intensive, and it also requires having teams of researchers that are attached onto programs. So not every project or program is going to have access to that. So I would say that there's something kind of specific about what Braced was able to do, and that isn't necessarily going to be replicated to other kinds of locally led adaptation projects or consortiums. I think what's different about what has been done by some of the other panelists here, because they're talking a lot more about how the money is dispersed and how it's spent. So it's not focusing on this outcome. And looking at a process, again, it entails a different kind of accountability and measurement. And so we can learn something different from that. And I'm really intrigued by all of these initiatives. If we're talking about comparability and why we want to compare, I think it does make sense if we're looking across projects to be able to see if there's gaps in what's happening, which approaches are serving projects. I think with the Braced M&E, using these kinds of adaptive, absorptive, and anticipatory capacities, it did give us this kind of overview where we could realize that across these different projects, a lot of them were focused far more on the immediate term. So people's ability to anticipate hazards or people's ability to immediately cope with their impacts, but there were far fewer projects that were looking at the longer term adaptation to shocks and stresses. And when we're talking about locally led adaptation, we are talking about future shocks and stresses. So that was kind of an important point that doing this kind of overview drew attention to. But I would still argue that that's an issue of project design. So maybe that's something that we kind of need to aggregate and look at the early stages of project, or we need to have really adaptive and flexible projects where implementers are able to sort of build in perhaps different kinds of activities if there is a demand for more longer term adaptation activity solutions. I don't know, when we're talking in this kind of aggregate way, it can be kind of hard to understand or define. So I would say, do we need to measure? We do, but we need to be skeptical about it. I really like data. I like telling a story about what happened with it. We all know that traditional M&E is too focused on upwards accountability. So I really think that anything that we measure should be about trying to internalize learning and improving practice for those that are implementing the projects. So yes, donors are never going to be able to completely step away from their internal accountability mechanisms, but we need to also create more incentive to be looking at how the projects are implemented, how can that support the learning for implementers. So I'm really keen to learn from other colleagues who have kind of broached with their different efforts.
Would anyone else like to take this question on why we have metrics and why we should method them? Alex, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So from our point of view, so I think when USAID made these announcements for the targets for greater localization in their approaches, I think generally we were very pleased, and like they're very encouraging announcements. They're ambitious targets, and significant sums of money implied by these targets as well. So the research that we did was actually supported by a group of US NGOs, so people like Oxfam and CARE, Save the Children. We had a coalition of NGOs, US NGOs that supported the research. So we were generally pleased with these targets. But what we realized was that the metrics that are used and the way that progress to these targets is measured could make the difference between genuine locally led activities happening, or things could be captured that aren't genuinely locally led. So one of the big concerns was a lot of US funding goes through large US companies, so large US consultancies deliver a lot of USAID projects, and obviously they could set up a local office in a country which is a local office of that consultancy firm, and if that was considered in the metrics as local, it wouldn't make the difference. So, you know, with these targets, what we're hoping is that USAID funding will shift away from predominantly being delivered by these big consultancy firms and will go to local organizations, local CSOs, local NGOs, local civil society. And so if, and so what we were keen to happen was that these, you know, local branches, local offices of big consultancies wouldn't be captured in the metrics that are measuring progress towards those targets. So that's what we really wanted to do, because you know, it would also create perverse incentives to set up those kinds of offices if the metrics that were being used would capture them. So we carried out the research with the nuance to exclude those types of offices. And then in terms of the question around the audience for the metrics, because this target has been set by the USAID administrator, it's a government, you know, it's a US government policy. It's monitored by the US Congress. So we actually launched the research in the US Congress, and we launched it with an audience of including Congress staffers. We actually had USAID on the panel as well, responding. And what Congress will hold the US government to account for progress towards the target. So what we're hoping is that Congress will take this on board and will encourage USAID to actually look at genuine local organizations when it's measuring progress towards this target, and genuine principles of local development and locally led development. So while metrics can seem like a sort of boring, geeky topic, it has this kind of real world application when it hits the ground. So yeah, so that's why we did it.
I think you have both raised very interesting points about accountability already. Alex, I think the involvement of Congress in the research is a way of holding the USAID accountable for their commitment to locally led adaptation. I wonder if Mercy and Bertha, you could reflect on a bit the role of metrics in accountability, improving donor accountability. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, what Florence and Alex have said makes a lot of sense. And I think for a donor who's working with, and especially if they're working with grassroots communities, for FFI, it was a chance for them to hear from the practitioners themselves. And I talked to, most of my interviews were actually with the farmers or with the community members who were doing monitoring in the fields, and the women who had been trained, and to see whether all the things they had said they're going to do, and some of those things we quickly realized are set in the project design, and I think Florence mentioned that. Most likely, all these elements will be hidden in either activities, in the expectations, and whatever outcomes the project wants. But we wanted to really understand from the community perspective whether they knew whether this was even something FFI wanted to achieve, or whether it makes any sense to their community, and how the projects are set up and how they're translated after either, because we realize that FFI does stay on a certain landscape for a little longer than at least 7 months, or 7 years, and some of them are going out for up to 10 years. And that sometimes translates into different things, like it would probably be the same project, but they are undertaking different activities with different communities and community-based organizations. And I think for them, it was a time to reflect on how they approach communities and how they approach a certain landscape with certain activities. And we quickly, I think in Uganda, women involvement was not necessarily a problem, but women would rather just leave those leadership roles to men because of the cultural practice in that area. When it comes to, I think in Myanmar, women just referred to be involved. They were doing gibbon-friendly coffee, and there were just certain activities during the process between training, planting, management, and post-harvest management. They're just activities they choose to do, and that was not necessarily a measure of inclusivity. It's just certain activities they just referred to do, and they will not engage themselves in certain activities, not because it was not something they couldn't do, it's just something they preferred not to do, and you can't force that on them. So I think it was a time to reflect what exactly each of those principles meant for the communities, because first of all, and I said this earlier, we quickly again discovered these were not new things, they were things that were already practicing. And in some of the cases, just discussing whether they had put up better plans or safeguarding measures or even documents to certify this is how we do certain things. For example, in grievance mechanism, we realized that most communities had their own way of solving conflict, but FFI did not necessarily have a grievance mechanism for this certain project that was standard, and there probably was no need for it because communities already have their own grievance mechanism. But it's probably important for how, again, communities hold these offices accountable, and also, just giving a proper feedback loop throughout the project period, and especially if you're going to be there for longer. But I think another thing that was also important in financing is deciding for how long can you be around a certain landscape, claiming that you are, or at least you say that you support local institutions. How long can you do that for until they are stable and are able to support themselves fully? And the other thing I think that was also, that we had a little bit of, contention trying to decide is when you say you support a certain organization for this many years, what are you hoping to achieve? At what point are they fully independent? At what point can you say now, we have built an institution to a point where you're no longer dependent on us? And at what point do they move away then from that landscape? So I think it was sort of a mirror for them to see what exactly they're doing with communities and how communities view that and what communities still expect from them. Because I think across board, there has been a lot of, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of donors will come, start up projects, and as soon as they leave, the project dies because that was an FF500 project, so therefore they just quickly go on to the next one. And I think for donors, it's really to ask themselves what it really means to fund a community and what do you really want to do with them and what do you hope to achieve? Because especially with market linkages, with how much support that goes into training and capacity building, all those were areas that they really had a lot to reflect on, and what does it mean to really say that communities participated in monitoring and evaluation? What does it mean for them to say we have early warning system or we understand adaptive management? What does that really mean in that particular community? Because I think it was highly contextualized and it was also highly different depending on the community, the culture, at what time you're engaging with them, and who else was a player in that area. All those were elements that can reflected on the principles, but meant very different things for different people in the project. Yep.
Thank you, Mercy. I think we have some people that are pro metrics right now, and the role that it can play beyond just people who are interested in metrics for nerdy reasons. Bertha, what do you think about the role of metrics and holding the GCF accountable potentially?
Thank you. I mean, I don't think I have that much to add. I think a lot of what I was like, the logic behind our work has been said, but I will just try to also give a bit of context to that question from our side. And I think it relates a lot to what Florence said about accountability, not only to the we don't like the word donor, to the contributors of the GCF, but also accountability to the communities. Because I think when in the design of our project from which this paper came, the one of the main, I was going to say, theses or beliefs of this project is that there should be accountability to the communities and the people that are supposed to be benefiting from this funding through the GCF specifically, and that civil society organizations have a role to play in ensuring that accountability. Because of course, I mean, this accountability should come from the fund themselves and the contributors themselves. But if it doesn't, then that civil society can step in and provide also not only the accountability, but also in a sense, also, let's say, an independent evaluation of what's actually happening on the ground. And so that's kind of where all of this came from. And as I said, this particular work didn't actually look at implementation. It only looked at, the design of the project, which is in itself a stage of the cycle anyway. Another part of the project did actually look at implementation, and there was actually locally CSO-led monitoring and evaluation on the ground of GCF-funded activities, but that's a separate part of the work. But yeah, basically it's in a sense to ensure that accountability and that what's happening actually, but basically to ensure that accountability also includes the affected communities, for better or worse, like beneficiary, those benefiting or probably being damaged by these projects. So that's kind of the context of this. I will say though, that what Mercy said is it's really interesting, and this is a lesson learned from us as well, because even though we work as a consortium of civil society organizations, we didn't reach a level in which we can claim that these results reflect the community, because we didn't actually, this is civil society organizations at the national level, and the decision on indicators and the questions is something that was developed by civil society at the national level. And so ideally, and this is something we learn, especially in the monitoring and the CSO-led monitoring and evaluation, is that this work that we've done now needs to go a level, more in the localization, and actually start working with local CSOs, local community groups, and to get them involved in similar work, so that these can actually reflect their priorities and their needs in the future. Because, ideally, for example, when we develop the indicators, when we set the questions that we were going to use to evaluate these indicators, they should have participated, and then we would have claimed, at least a bit with more certainty, that we were reflecting community needs and priorities. But we didn't get there. And as I said, this has been a lesson that many of our partners have learned, that now, we need to reach the local level, really, in the engagement with the GCF, and not just the national level. So maybe for the future, I think it's quite important that reaches that level as well. And that, when we talk about locally led adaptation, it also, reflects those local priorities and needs and ways of perceiving success, because at the end of the day, it's about that, right? It's about who gets to determine what success is in a project, and usually comes from the implementing entities or national level civil society. But at the end of the day, we also need to hear what successful projects and successful interventions means from the community level. So that's for the future, and as a lesson for us as well.
I think that's a perfect segue into my final question for all of you before we go into the more fun session where you ask each other questions. What is an inclusive process that involves local communities in developing metrics? What does it look like? Berta, you already hinted, okay, this is maybe we need to go a level below, get more communities involved. I'd like to ask all of you to reflect on this, what the process should look like, and what we should do. So start with you, Florence, Alex, then Mercy, then back to you, Bertha, then we'll wrap up this current session. Florence, go ahead.
So the Braced M&E framework is one where, because again, aggregating across all these different countries, all these different projects, the M&E process itself, in terms of measuring resilience, was not necessarily community-led. The extent to which it reflected community priorities was something that was kind of tested more in some of the evaluations. There was some experimental M&E that was conducted alongside the sort of broader M&E process. Sorry, I just had a point. I've just forgotten it. Move on to somebody else and I'll come right back.
Okay, coming to you, Alex, and we'll come back to you, Florence.
I do you want to go, Florence, and then I'll.
Yes, I actually want to say this is, it's actually quite a complicated and thorny issue when we're talking about actually truly having that kind of downward accountability. Anytime I'm doing this kind of vulnerability or climate risk assessment and we're having a focus group discussion, the first questions I like to ask are, what are some of the big issues that are happening in this place? What are some of the things that have changed here in the last 10 years? Just to get a broader sense. And yes, environmental issues, climate issues kind of nip at the edges, but often the answer will be something like drug use is so high amongst young people here, or the health clinic doesn't have the supplies when we need it. It's something that might not actually be relevant to what the project is trying to do. So then there's this kind of question of how do we design when there are issues in the community that are immediately important, but that may not be sort of what a longer term climate change adaptation project is trying to do. Every project to some extent grapples with this, but I think that that accountability means we really need to properly be willing to engage with what communities find most important, even if that's not necessarily how we have developed this really complicated and elegant theory of change, and it doesn't sort of fit so neatly inside of it. Maybe this is where the locally led adaptation principle about decentralizing decision-making works well, because then we're not making these decisions very up high, but then there's more flex to deal with immediate priorities as well as some of these longer-term climate priorities.
Yes, I think it also relates to the locally led adaptation principle on understanding local climate risks and the ones that are actually being faced by communities. All right, over to you, Alex. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, when we've been looking at these questions, I think the way that we look at this is that the reason that we would prioritize locally led development and localization generally is by involving local communities, you can be more responsive to what local needs are. You can aid and development projects are going to be more sustainable because the community will be involved in them. And also you will be able to build local capacity by working with local communities, and projects will be more sustainable. So the way that we've also looked at it is by thinking about local community involvement at the level of local projects, but also at the level of planning and design and project design at the national level, looking at what national level priorities are, and with large projects getting community voices involved, because what we see in bad practice is where outside actors come in and have a top-down approach that isn't responsive to local needs, doesn't involve local communities, doesn't have local buy-in, and that often leads to development projects that aren't appropriate, that aren't responding to local needs, and because they don't have local buy-in, they aren't sustainable into the future. So those are the reasons that we think that locally led development should be locally led adaptation should be prioritized. It's just a better way of doing development projects, and we should get away from this approach of externally imposed priorities and externally imposed design of projects.
Right, I think we're all in agreement. Mercy and Bertha, do you have ideas on how we should do this? Go ahead, Mercy.
Yeah, I think there's no way around it. If you say you're working with communities, work with them. If you're going to introduce a project without a needs assessment from the community, that's top down. And I feel, because I've worked with community-based organizations for a very long time, and I feel it's really not that hard. If you really are a donor and you have certain objectives and you want to work with communities, talk to the communities. And I think what we've said, again, is a lot of elite capture in, again, especially with, let's say, civil organizations who work directly with communities, is that they will know or have an idea of what's happening from either the local counties or things like that. They'll pick one thing and that's what they want to work on and introduce that to the communities is the next great thing. And sometimes that's not really bad because the local administrators will know exactly what's wrong. But if it's a community-based organization that already, again, has a mandate and is already working there and they have completely articulated what their problem is and what intervention they need, just talk to them and plan around it. Go through the process, because sometimes, again, it translates to, again, what are the guidelines from the donor? And some of those projects are really, really complex. Or there's a cap to how much money you can get if you have certain capacity. And again, there has been, an issue of saying communities do not have capacity to handle certain things, and therefore they need these intermediaries. And again, that's a very wide range from, how do they access information about funding? How do they access it? How do they apply? How much support do they get? What are they trained on? And that translates to involvement, whether that is decision making, who makes the decision, how does the information get to them, and at what point does that information get to them, and whether it is with gender inclusivity, who introduces that to the community, what's the structure like, and I think it translates to everything else. climate risks? What is it that they have already been doing to survive, before your intervention? How are you going to either amplify that or change that in a way that they see that as their own initiative? And I'm speaking from seeing a lot of initiatives that have failed because they introduced the next best idea to thinking that this was going to solve that. And as soon as that project closes, our story is over. They go back to their old ways. So I think there's really no way around it. If you want to work with communities, work with communities. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And Berta, last but not least.
Thanks. I mean, as usual, I think most of the important points have been made. I mean, we were looking at it more from the evaluation point of view, right? So not the planning one, which is kind of the question that's being asked. But I think from what I've heard, what I could reflect on is, first of all, I totally agree with Mercy. I mean, if you're going to say you're going to work with communities, work with communities. At the same time, if you think about what EDA stands for, ideally you have to work with communities, at least not if you are some, German Watch, Global North organization. You would just put that funding into national platforms that then would talk to communities and are more able to understand them because they're in the country and understand the context well enough. And so, you don't actually, at least from like the perspective of international organizations and international donors, you don't actually need to do it. Someone else at the country that understands the context better would do it for you. At the same time, I mean, I think it also depends. You can go a bit beyond because, for example, Florence was giving the example of maybe the community has a priority on drug use. And thinking about that example, I mean, that's a problem, but where does that problem come from? I mean, it might come from, let's say, poverty related to resource unavailability, which is somehow related to climate change. And so if you dig a bit deeper and you really understand, if you already identify that there's a climate issue in this community, then a lot of what you will see as priorities is probably a consequence of that problem. And if you really understand that context, if you really go a bit deeper into that conversation with the community and you really listen and you really understand the context, then you might realize that the problem that you thought was there, which is climate impact, need for adaptation, is there and that it needs to be addressed, And so what I would say is, that's, I think, in theory, at least, the beauty of this idea of devolved decision-making is that you will give decision-making to the people that really understand the problem, not from a superficial, I go there, I speak to the community a couple of times, but really understands it. And then the solutions that will come out, maybe it will be climate change, maybe it won't, but I think we need to be ready to accept that some of the problems can't be solved with very specific climate related things and are broader issues, that require many dimensions to be addressed. So, yeah.
Thank you. I agree with all of you, and I really believe in the importance of awareness raising, and I think maybe sharing learning and awareness of climate change with communities even before you get to the level of them developing metrics for your specific project is really important as well. Otherwise, the indicators will be around drug use, things that are of priority to the communities. So there needs to be a step before you can actually develop metrics that are appropriate for your project, I think. Okay, so yeah, Mercy, go for it.
And to just, again, still stress onto that point that Florence made, and I think right now, just a current example that's happening right now in Kenya is that there has been, almost a 3-year drought and all priorities have shifted. It's now access to grazing and access to water. And if most of this, again, funding is not flexible, then it becomes a problem. You can't call people to train them on marketplace literacy when the cows are dying. It does not make sense to them. They will not be there. So I think flexibility and also just, again, understanding the local context and what you're dealing with and being able to quickly, address that issue. And I think the strength there and opportunity is to always collaborate with other players and to not always, and I think, again, it's a tendency with conservation or climate-led organizations to just work by themselves. They're the only ones addressing the problem and not, again, collaborating and look who else is addressing this problem, even if it's from a different sector, and giving it a really multidisciplinary approach to make sure you do not be off too far from your mandate. Yeah.
I'll let you all take over now, because I think this is the fun session and you get to ask each other questions. And audience, please share with us your questions for the audience as well, for the panelists as well. And for now, I'll just let the panelists discuss and ask each other questions. Go for it, Florence.
Mercy, I just wanted to jump on that last point where you're talking about the flexibility of funding. And I really think this is something, BRACE has a kind of interesting component to it, where we're saying we want to look at the absorptive capacity of people's ability to cope with climate extremes, climate related hazards. And so as part of that, there was then a bucket of money that was set aside that was called a crisis modifier. And if a project experienced some kind of drought or shock during the project implementation timeframe, then they could access that funding. And so then it was also sort of increasing that capacity at the same time. So there's a sort of meta level in which it was happening, and then we're also measuring it at the sort of outcome or community level. I think some of the really interesting learning from BRACE came out of some of the research around that, but then we're not necessarily sort of integrating that into our M&E systems. We're not saying, oh, in this community, we see that there's very low absorptive capacity, so we're allocating the funding there. You know, it's just something that's kind of attached to the program. It's not necessarily embedded into the monitoring and the tracking. So perhaps there's ways that we can learn to do that when we're applying these LLA principles.
Great. Do you have questions for each other? No questions at all. I did have a question for Alex, because I think your organization identified what localized means, basically, because you took the definition of what USAID had, and then made your own interpretation. I'd like to understand how you arrived at that definition, and if others could also share what localization is based on your experiences and developing the metrics.
Sure. No, thanks for the question. We were looking specifically at organizations, so we haven't had as nuanced an approach as what you're all talking about with the locally led adaptation principles, which go into details of how programming is done, processes of how programming is carried out, and so on. But we were just looking, our unit of analysis was at the organization level. So we were looking at organizations and trying to define whether these were local organizations or not. And the way that we developed our approach was by looking at approaches that have been proposed by several other organizations. So there's an organization called NEAR, NEAR, which is a coalition of local CSOs. It's a network organization, and they have come up with a definition of what a local organization is. So we took their definition because we didn't feel like we were in a position to, as a London-based international campaign organization, we didn't feel like we were in a position to make that definition ourselves. So we took the definition that NEAR has developed. There's also the Grand Bargain, which is a humanitarian a set of principles for humanitarian aid. Their standing committee has also got a definition as well. So we looked at those two definitions and kind of put them together and came up with this approach. But what we were keen to also do is to not say that that this is the last word in what defining a local organization is. We wanted to keep it open and flexible, because there's a lot of nuances in terms of local organizations and what people see as being important features. So one of the questions is whether a diaspora-led organization that's based overseas, so let's say a Syrian-based diaspora organization that's based in the UK, but it's run by Syrian refugees, for example, to support development in Syria, whether that should count as a local organization. And obviously, if you're defining where the headquarters is one of your central characteristics, that would be excluded in that case. So there are nuances, and we didn't want to come up with a sort of final definition. So we used our definition as an example, But then we've also have this public dashboard, which I've shared a link to, and that allows users to develop their own definition and see how that would affect the final results. So yeah.
Interesting reflections. Anyone else want to jump in on this question?
I mean, I can quickly, like, we, as I said, we've developed indicators for this. So, I mean, I don't know how useful it would be for me to like go through them, but I could just quickly basically explain that when we were looking at the proposal and thinking about locally, like I already said, what we define as local, organizations, but when we were thinking about the principle of devolving decision making, we use level of localization to like kind of assess how devolved the decision making was. And basically, we established a range of let's say ways in which this could be approached, that goes from like the local actors, the subnational actors and local communities are not consulted and do not participate in design and delivery of this project, all the way down to basically subnational actors and local communities are the ones that set the agenda, that lead the design, that have the decision-making authority within the project. So from that, there's quite a few steps in between, but basically we analyze project designs in that scale to see how localized we could consider a project to be. So just quickly give that.
Thank you. It seems like you were looking at different levels, subnational and community level, and that's how you define localization. Great. Okay, there's a question from Efsara. How do we work with local institutions and local NGOs in setting up indicators to measure the 8 principles of LLA, as it is very context specific? I think we touched on this a little bit before, and I think Efsara, you really want to know how it is that we should do this, because as we're discussing, working with the national level is very different from working at the community level. So how do we go about actually setting up the indicators that align with the principles of LLA? Are we going to pick some principles over others, or can we actually try to cover all the principles of LLA? What do you all think?
I think it depends on who we is. Are you a donor? Are you, working through the government? At what level of engagement are you on? And why are you supporting them? How do you engage with them? What's your objective? How are you working with them? But from my experience, I think it's best to keep it as context specific as possible. And I think LLAs were developed as some sort of compass to guide where that conversation should be going, not necessarily saying and stamping down that this is what it should be and this is what it should be for certain people. And I think defining it locally means what is important to those people, how is it that they see it, and what would it mean for them to still reflect on what the campus is saying, but what makes sense to them and is applicable to them. So for me is by supporting them from where they are and where they're trying to go. It's just keeping it as contextually, specific as possible. Yeah.
Yes,
Can I just quickly, sorry, sorry. So I think the question that Mercy asked is very important, well, all of the questions, who we are and what the purpose of that is. At the same time, I was thinking, well, I mean, once you've defined and answered those questions, and going back to what you asked at the beginning, May, which is, do we use them all? Are they all applicable or not? My guess, and I haven't tried to do this, is that if you do actually define these from the point of view of the community, the answers are going to be very different. And so you're not going to have one way of looking at this across, I don't know, depending on whether you want to do one country, many countries, whatever. There's not going to be one way of doing that. So I guess the beauty of for lack of a better word or phrase, top-down approaches is that you can make these overarching framework that applies to everyone and have, comparisons and stuff like that. But then obviously that loses the value of like, the perspective of communities. But if what you want is a perspective of communities, then most likely you're not going to have one framework. You're going to have many that will reflect different priorities, the different objectives, the different needs of the community. So it really depends what you want to do. I mean, I think it is, in a way, I guess, and because I've done it, the top down, let's have one framework apply to everyone, has some value. And like, we should use it for what the purpose it serves. But I think also having the non-comparable, but reflecting the realities and the needs and the priorities has also a lot of value. And so, maybe we could aim for both, for different reasons, for different purposes, for different objectives, as Mercy said at the beginning.
Yes, I think it's good to have an open mind as well in approaching this. So you're not framing yourself, boxing yourself with one framework or one result that you want to see. So there's one question from Vincent. I'll ask a final question too, and panelists, please feel free to answer any questions that you like. So there's a question about whether we should abandon log frames as the basis for results frameworks. That's question one. And my question to you is, what can we not measure? What cannot be quantified by metrics that is important in locally led adaptation? So mic drop, I'll walk away now with that question. Florence, go ahead.
That should we abandon log frames is a really interesting question. It's one that I've batted around for such a long time, because in a way theories of change came around as almost an alternative to log frames, where we say, here's our end goal, and we have this idea for how we think we can achieve it. And in a way, it has the constituent components of the log frame, but we're not just assuming that this input comes to this result. As you were mentioning earlier, we know that the attribution of what leads to that result has so many different factors into it, and we're one small part of it. And then that theory of change could then be modified more easily. We can change the indicators if communities' priorities change. There's things that we can do, but the end goal ultimately remains the same. But then in practice, we're not using theories of change that way. We use them the same way we use log frames, or we're using them in addition to using log frames. So it's a thorny issue, because it's kind of, there's such a mindset in the ways that we track and measure things that it's hard to step away from them and actually be imaginative about what is a true alternative. Like, what ways can we track things that don't sort of fall into the 1 + 1 = 2, and this is how we're going to do that, activity plus output plus outcome. We have these very regimented ways of measuring things, and to apply the LLA principles, maybe this is an opportunity for us to think, as you said, beyond the log frame. But I don't have a good answer to that in this one session. I think I need to sit and think about it a bit more.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think maybe abandon is a strong word. Can they be developed in a way that is applicable to the people who you're using it with? I think it's really, in my view, because I feel like, again, there are different levels of accountability. If it's a donor who is trying to see whether their money they're giving is making the impact they had hoped to achieve. And if it's a community, you've sent them these big templates that are supposed to be filled out by, every, annually or quarterly. Is there a way those things can be simplified? Is there a way it can be more easier for communities to use? And there's one Indigenous group that I work with, and what they have adopted eventually is because they realized, because donors are not, they have not changed their way of accountability. They have their own way of accounting for the things that they want to see. And sometimes it goes down to that. You employ somebody who understands donor language, and that's their work, and then you have your own way of accounting. And I feel like there's an opportunity to either make them, again, by listening and communicating, by developing, by learning best practices. It's really a matter of what is working for the people you're working with and what makes sense to them. And also ensuring that even if that means different levels of accountability, are they understandable? Are they usable? And I think there should always be room for change. So if in certain elements they're no longer needed, they can be abandoned. And if in certain cases it's still important, for high-level reporting, that could still be retained at that level. But is there a way to make the cascading process easier for the people we really need that to, to change? Because administrative work, again, has been a big issue with community-based organizations. The amount of time you need to sit down and fill out administration things, administrative issues, sometimes takes so much time. And you have an implementing team that goes to the field and brings you the information, and somebody is seriously based on, in an office, and that takes, again, adds to more staff costs. Then now the issue of capacity comes in. I feel like all these things could be resolved as time goes by people, again, engaging thoroughly in the process and critically assessing, is whatever we are doing impactful? And I feel like that space of monitoring and evaluating what we've been doing and just quickly adapting to what else can we do is a space that should always stay open.
Wonderful. Would anyone like to jump in with a quick thought?
So I'll offer a couple of thoughts on your question, May, in terms of what can't be measured. This, it seems like a quite philosophical question, or the way that I'm approaching it is quite philosophical. So, I think with metrics, I think we need to be realistic about that. There's lots that we're not going to be able to measure, and that metrics are indicators, and they provide an indication. But you're always going to leave lots out. So I think that maybe the idea is not to try and measure everything and not to try and capture everything, but to do the best that we can with small bits of information that are going to provide an indication, and try and get those to be precise and useful as possible, but realize that there's lots of reality that's not going to be captured. And if you're dealing with complex things like community processes, democratic processes, and that type of thing, there's lots there that you're just simply not going to be able to capture. So I think being realistic about the limitations of metrics is important as well.
Great. I think that's a good note to end on. Yes, metrics are really useful. For the most part, we've agreed that if they are done in a way that involves communities, they would be more useful, but there are things that metrics cannot measure. So try to pick the ones that are most useful for the purposes, for your own purposes. I've been asked to ask everyone to turn on their camera so we can take a group picture. So please turn on your cameras if you don't have your cameras on already. Ellen, Sarah, Afsara, others, please turn your cameras on. All right. And who is taking the picture? Afsara, I think you are. Cool. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, panelists, for an amazing discussion. I think we had fun talking about lots of different things related to metrics, and we haven't solved it all, but hopefully we can continue our conversations and find better ways to engage communities in developing metrics for LLA. And thank you very much, audience, for your questions and your participation as well. And we look forward to seeing you in whatever venues that we show up at. All right. And Goveshna is still going on, I imagine. So we'll see you in other Goveshna sessions as well. So thank you very much and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you, May.